of waiting on you to start, and then we'll go ahead and go. So today we've come to the second Sunday in a three-part series that we started last week on the book of Ruth. And I'm hoping that you'll be freshly encouraged today, not just by hearing the story, but by seeing yourself in the story. And I'm praying that someday, that somehow, it will help change people's lives. Not necessarily just here in Second Life, but all the people who listen to us on the live stream, on Mixler, on YouTube, all the other ways we go out. And so because I'm not just hearing the story, though, but realizing that you're part of a much bigger story that includes God's love for you. So if you weren't here last week, let me review where we are in the story. Now, we just did chapter 1 last week, and it's a love story that's far better than any movie you could watch or romance novel you could read in our culture today. We have this woman named Naomi. She was married to this guy named Elimelech, and they had 2 sons. They left Bethlehem in the Promised Land during a time of famine and went to Moab, which is a forbidden land known for idolatry and immorality. Moabite women in particular had once seduced Israelite men, and 24,000 people died as a result. To Israel, it was a forbidden place, and it was a forbidden people. When Naomi's family got there, her 2 sons married Moabite women named Orpah and Ruth. And as I mentioned last week, I've been calling her Oprah for years, and finally caught that her name is not spelled O-P-R-A-H, it's O-R-A-P-A-H. And Naomi's husband and her 2 sons died unexpectedly. We don't know when. We do know that they died without having produced heirs. And so Naomi was left alone in a foreign land with 2 Moabite daughter-in-laws. Neither one of them had children. She had no more sons. And then suddenly she hears that their food was available in Bethlehem, and so she decides to go back home. She tried to persuade Orpah and Ruth to stay in Moab for their good, and so that they could have children, so they could remarry and have kids. And Ruth clung to Naomi and committed herself to be with Naomi, support her, live with her, die with her, and follow Yahweh, Naomi's God. So thus Naomi came back to Bethlehem with Ruth, and chapter 1 ends with a picture of bitterness, sadness, and suffering. Naomi had left Bethlehem with everything, and in her words, she came back with nothing but a Moabite daughter-in-law who was actually a picture of the calamity God had brought upon her. At the end of chapter 1, we do see a glimmer of hope, because the harvest season is just beginning in Bethlehem. The promise we walked away from last week is that God is able to turn sorrowful tragedy into surprising triumph. In the moments when God seems furthest away, He may be setting the stage for the greatest display of His faithfulness. And we know, for example, the cross is one of those things. It was a horrible tragedy God used to show triumph because He brought salvation through that cross. And that brings us to Ruth 2, and much like we did last week, I just want us to walk through the story to hear what the original listeners heard when they were told the story. And then in the process of try to put ourselves in the story. Now let's see the characters' faces. Let's feel their emotions. Let's try to catch the beauty and the depth of all that's happening. Now understand, and we talked about this last week, that this is not written in English. This is written in Hebrew. And the way they express things and the language, it's very, very illustrative. So, the reality is that there's a lot in the language that we don't catch in the English translation. And so there's some things in here that might make this a little bit more, be more amazing. But anyway. And so we're going to go verse by verse and pause along the way. So the Bible says in Ruth 2:1 that now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. So in chapter 1, we had 2 main characters, the odd couple, Naomi and Ruth. Things looked pretty bleak. Remember, the 2 problems we identified the story was to solve was the fact that these women were in need of food, and they were in need of family, because women weren't allowed to own land, they weren't allowed to do anything, they weren't even allowed to testify in court. So the reality is that they were at the dependent of begging, basically. They were been the poor among the poor if they didn't have a family to protect them. They didn't have, not like modern America where we have this huge social monster, Social Security and all that other stuff. But the reality is it's always been the church's responsibility to care for the poor. That's always been the case. And when the church doesn't do it, it's not doing its job. And I'm not going to go off on that soapbox, but anyway. But then we have Boaz, and he's from the clan of Elimelech, the single most important social family group in Israelite society. A clan basically consisted of various families descended from a common ancestor. So as an individual, you were part of a family that was part of a clan, and the clan was ultimately part of a tribe. The clan was significant because as part of a clan, you had responsibilities to care for the other members of your clan. So first, Boaz from the clan of Elimelech, Naomi's husband. The second fact about Boaz is he's described as a worthy man. Now, this could be a reference to his wealth, but it's also likely to be a reference to his character. In fact, the same phrase in the original language is used to describe Gideon back in Judges 6 as a man of valor and might. So that's kind of the same idea here. So amidst a bleak ending of chapter 1 for his family, chapter 2 opens with a picture of a worthy man in his family. At this point, the narrator is telling us about Boaz just by way of information, and then he immediately shifts back to the picture of Naomi and Ruth in verse 2. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So here's the deal. In Israel, God had this set up so that if you were poor, you could go during harvest time and glean leftovers from the and landowners and harvesters were commanded to leave grain in the corners of their fields in order to provide for those who had no land or food. It wouldn't be much. One commenter said it was like trying to survive in the past by selling bottle caps or recycling aluminum cans, but it was more than nothing, and it at least kept them fed. So Ruth set out to find a field where she could collect a little bit of grain for her and Naomi. Anybody who was poor like Ruth was dependent on a landowner being willing to leave some grain here or there for those who were less fortunate. So as Ruth goes out, right, she was completely at the mercy of finding a kind landowner. And to make matters worse for her, as the author points out, she was Ruth the Moabite, the foreigner. And not just a foreigner, but a foreigner with a bad reputation because of where she's from. She was literally a woman without a clan and was going as a Moabite alone to the fields of the Israelites, trying to find somebody who would let her collect just a little bit of grain. But with Naomi's permission, Ruth went out, and listen to verse 3, this is good. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan Elimelech. Now, don't you love this? As it turned out, she just so happened to find herself in a field belonging to Boaz. Literally, it says as chanced in the original language. The aim of the author is to clearly point out that this was no accident. It's like he's saying, wouldn't you know it? Out of all the fields Ruth could have wandered into that day in Bethlehem, she just accidentally happened to find herself in the field of Boaz. Then the writer says, and just in case you forgot, Boaz is from the clan of Elimelech. Now, don't miss what the Bible's teaching here. Nothing happens by accident, not with a sovereign God who is in control. I think about it, I've been in ministry now 40 years almost. But I came to grace because of a tragedy. I was serving as the associate pastor at Del Rio Community Church in Port St. Lucie, and I got sick, very, very sick. Ended up in the hospital, and they put me in a coma. They induced a medical coma, and I was out for a month. And I was on a do not move order because every time I moved, my oxygen content would drop. I had pneumonia in one lung, and so they had me on this machine. Now, part of the problem was that I had pneumonia in both lungs, but one pneumonia was caused by the medical staff at the hospital. Well, not the medical staff, a nurse's aide who took it upon herself to change my diet without permission from the doctor or the nurse, or the respiratory therapist who was working with me. Came in for pneumonia, I was recovering, was getting better, and she thought I was getting better, and she heard the doctor and the nurse talking about changing my diet back to moving me towards solid food, and she heard it, and she thought she'd be smart, and so she changed it, and ended up changing my diet to solid food, and I was on pure oxygen. Now, I don't know if you know anything about oxygen, but oxygen, they put a numbing agent in it because oxygen burns. And so what the idea is that while you're taking oxygen, you don't want to have to, your muscles and the nerve endings in your throat don't feel anything. And what happened was she brought me she brought me in solid food, first solid food I'd had in weeks, in about 2 weeks. And I was recovering. They were talking about taking me off the respirator, taking me off the oxygen, and moving me back toward, a normal diet. And getting, I was recovering. I was doing well. And she fed me this chicken, and of course, my body, because it's numb, and I ate it too fast. I'll be the first to admit that. That's part of my problem. But the reality is, she should have never fed me solid food. And it went down the other lung, and so I had aspiration pneumonia in one lung and viral pneumonia in the other lung. And so they had to put me on a respirator and to vacuum out my lung to get the chicken out of there. Needless to say, they put me on a coma, and I was there for almost 2 weeks. I guess I was on a coma about 2 weeks, and came to, and I hadn't been moved in 2 weeks. And so I had lost all ability to do anything. I couldn't move. I couldn't move my legs. I couldn't lift my hand. I couldn't sit up. I was a lump with a trach tube down my thing and a feeding tube down my throat, and that's how I was. So I spent from December, January, February, March, and April in that hospital. Well, not in that hospital. I got moved several times. Once I got moved to respiratory therapy, which nearly killed me because those people were idiots. Anyway, they're no longer in business, by the way. We ended up having to file a federal lawsuit against them because they while I was there, 17 people died in the 1 week I was there. And it was like a killing place. And we'll not go there. That place is out of business. They were shut down. The doctors lost their licenses. 2 of them went to jail. It was horrible. Then they moved me to a different place, part of the Bethesda system. And there I got rehab and learned to walk again and learned how to do all this stuff again. So it was a very tough journey. But when I came out, I was going to be several weeks before I could travel. And I really couldn't drive, so I was depending on somebody giving me rides everywhere because I wasn't physically capable of driving at this point. I was still in a wheelchair. And so I started going to, I called my pastor and we talked, and he says, well, you probably need to see about, we really have too many pastors as it is, and maybe this is God telling you that you need to move on. And so we prayed about it, and I ended up leaving Del Rio Community Church, and I started attending First Baptist, but I really wanted to do ministry, and so I got involved in Second Life and met up with the pastor who was here at the time. It was a different place, but a different building and all that stuff, different property. But he ended up having a thing on Wednesday nights and Saturday nights where he couldn't come anymore. And so he was going to cancel Wednesday night and Saturday nights, so I volunteered to take over. And ended up preaching on Wednesday nights and preaching on Saturday nights, and then he would preach all day on Sunday. And then he decided to leave Second Life altogether for a while. He got some, I don't know exactly what happened, but he had some issues, and so he left church altogether, and I ended up taking over Sunday, and so I became pastor. But that was all God. I believe that was God taking tragedy and turning it into triumph. Now we have 3,000 people who listen to our podcast every week. It just absolutely blows my mind. Because I didn't set up that podcast expecting anything. That was God's doing. That's God taking tragedy and turning it into triumph. See, nothing happens by accident when God's in control. Point is, folks, we are not driven by faith. We are fate, but we're controlled by nor are we controlled by some blind chance or impersonal coincidence. There is a sovereign God who is always working in ways we don't realize for the good of his people and for the glory of his name. Look at the name Bethlehem. Just happens to walk up at the time. Boaz says, guys, have you ever been in a sappy movie that maybe